There are names that echo louder than the gunshots they once fired, names not just written in history books, but etched in the soul of a nation. Jesse James is one of those names, a shadow and a legend, a ghost in a long coat who rode through fire and folklore. Jesse James remains one of the most magnetic and controversial figures ever born on American soil. Not because he was the deadliest, nor the richest, nor the most feared, but because he was something far more enduring, a contradiction made flesh. To some, he was a ruthless outlaw, a murderer, a thief, a man with blood on his hands and steel in his eyes. To others, he was a hero in spurs, a rebel, a resistance fighter, the last gun in a war that refused to end. His story lives at the crossroads of fact and fiction, where newspapers bled truth into legend and campfire stories carved a new mythology. Like Robin Hood with a revolver, Jesse became the symbol of rebellion against the industrial North, a man who didn't just rob banks, he robbed the idea of order itself, and in doing so, he became immortal. Welcome to the story behind the photo, where we peel back the grainy images and yellowed pages to reveal the beating heart of the legends we thought we knew. Today, we dive deep into the myth and the man, Jesse Woodson James, to trace how a preacher's son from Missouri became America's most famous outlaw. But before the dust of revolvers and the blood of robbery, there was a boy, a family, and a war not yet fought. Jesse's story begins not with a gun, but with a marriage, a quiet union in the hills of Kentucky. His father, Robert Sally James, was a Baptist minister and scholar, a man of scripture and conviction. His mother, Zerelda Elizabeth Cole, was just as fierce in spirit, though raised on different doctrine, one forged through hardship and relentless will. They met during a revival meeting in Stamping Ground, Kentucky, and on December 28, 1841, they bound their fates together under the eye of God and the weight of the American frontier. Robert was a man of learning, earning a degree from Georgetown College, and with diploma in hand and a calling in his heart, he led his new wife westward to Clay County, Missouri, to a wilderness that would soon be known as Kearney. With help from neighbors and their own hands, they built a log cabin in the thick of untamed land, where Robert preached at a modest Baptist church and taught the gospel under open skies. Missouri at the time was not just a state, it was a question mark on the edge of civilization, a place where survival wasn't promised, and peace was often a pause between storms. Their family grew quickly. On January 10, 1843, their first son, Alexander Franklin James, was born on the farm, a boy who would grow into a quiet but loyal soul, destined to walk beside his brother in infamy. Then came tragedy. Robert James Jr., born in 1845, lived only 33 days before passing into the soil. Jesse Woodson James, the boy who would one day steal headlines and hearts, was born on September 5, 1847. And finally, in 1849, their daughter, Susan Lavinia James, arrived, completing the early circle of life on the James farm. But life on the frontier was never allowed to settle for long. In the early 1850s, drawn by the glint of gold and the call to serve as a chaplain for a caravan of Missouri men heading west, Reverend Robert James answered a different kind of mission. On April 12th, he left his family behind to preach to miners in the chaotic promise of California. He would never return. Just months after arriving, he contracted a fever from tainted water in the mining camps of Placerville. On August 18, 1850, far from home and family, the Reverend succumbed to cholera and was buried in an unmarked grave, lost to history, but never to the hearts of those he left behind. Zerelda, now a widow and mother of 3, one of them a restless 3-year-old Jesse, took the weight of the farm and the future on her own shoulders. Fierce and unyielding, she refused to be broken. She ran the homestead with iron will and sharp words, her grief buried under soil and sweat. She would later remarry more than once, but her loyalty remained with her children, and her influence, firm, unapologetic, and loyal to blood above all, would shape the men her sons became. The seeds of rebellion were not planted in gunpowder, but in loss. Not in the clang of iron bars, but in the silence of an empty chair at the table. Before Jesse James ever pointed a revolver, He learned what it meant to be left behind. If Jesse James was forged in fire, it was his family that first lit the match. After the death of her husband, Reverend Robert James, Zerelda was left with 3 young children, a farm to manage, and a frontier world that offered little mercy to widows. But Zerelda was not a woman easily broken. Her grief became grit, her vulnerability a blade. In a time when most women were expected to quietly remarry and retreat, Zerelda stepped forward with iron in her spine and defiance in her voice. Her second marriage, however, was a bitter mistake. She wed Benjamin Sims, a neighboring farmer who offered security in name only. The marriage quickly turned cold, marked by conflict, resentment, and an atmosphere far from safe for the growing James boys. Sims and the children never bonded. Discipline in the home became harsh, the climate stern and punishing. Zerelda, fiercely protective of her children, would not stand by in silence. As tensions escalated, she began seeking a divorce, a rare and daring act for a woman of her time, but fate intervened before the courts could. On January 2, 1854, Sims died in a riding accident, and the chapter closed as abruptly as it had opened. Zerelda, once again a widow, turned her focus fully back to her children and the farm that had become the bedrock of their survival. In 1855, a new path opened. Zerelda married Dr. Reuben Samuel, a physician of gentle temperament and financial stability. Unlike her previous husband, Samuel gave her trust, space, and authority. He let Zerelda manage the household as she saw fit, allowing her to make decisions about her children's upbringing and the expansion of their estate. Through land purchases and careful administration, the James Samuel family soon owned a vast tract of fertile Missouri land. And as was tragically common at the time, they acquired enslaved laborers to work the land. The economy of the region was bound to this cruel institution, and the James family's position, both socially and politically, became tied to the Southern cause. It was in this complex, combustible environment that Frank and Jesse James came of age. Frank, the eldest, was quiet, reflective, a boy often found with a book rather than a blade. He immersed himself in their late father's library, drawn especially to the writings of Shakespeare. He dreamed not of outlawry but of teaching. His was a mind shaped by words before it was hardened by war. Jesse, by contrast, was a force of nature. Charismatic, quick-witted, and full of charm, he had a grin that disarmed strangers, and a boldness that defied his youth. He was generous by instinct, proud by temperament, and playful even in moments of hardship. While Frank turned inward, Jesse faced the world with his chest out and fists ready, a natural leader, even as a boy. Together, they worked the farm, rode horses under Dr. Samuel's tutelage, and grew up under the long shadow of a nation on the verge of tearing itself apart. Then came 1861, the year the country split, the year dreams curdled into powder and smoke. Missouri became a battleground long before the first cannon fired. The state was a borderland, culturally Southern, economically tied to the North. Though Missouri voted to remain in the Union, deep divisions persisted. Confederate sympathies ran strong through the countryside, especially among families like the Jameses, whose lives, wealth, and worldview were tied to the Southern cause. In effect, Missouri became a war within a war, with 2 rival governments and countless acts of violence between neighbors who once shared meals. Frank James was 18 when he joined the Missouri State Guard, a Confederate militia. He fought in skirmishes across the state and quickly became hardened to the brutal realities of combat. His allegiance was never in question. The North, to him, represented tyranny. The South, freedom, at least the version of freedom as it was preached in the homes of his upbringing. In 1862, a new figure entered the family, the illegitimate son of Dr. Samuel and an enslaved woman, a child taken in and raised within the Samuel household. This detail, uncomfortable, complex, reveals the tangled contradictions of the era, where intimacy and injustice often walked hand in hand. During his time with the Missouri Guard, Frank participated in the Battle of Lexington, a bloody engagement that resulted in the deaths of more than 1,700 Union soldiers. It was a major Confederate victory in the region, one that boosted Southern morale and made names out of boys who had only recently been tilling soil. After the battle, Frank returned home, likely wounded or ill. But even his home was no longer a sanctuary. Unionist militias, suspicious of Confederate sympathizers, began targeting households, and the James Samuel farm, well known for its loyalties, came under scrutiny. One day Union troops arrived at the property, and what followed was a moment that would change Jesse James forever. Still just a teenager, Jesse was seized and interrogated by Unionist forces who suspected him of harboring rebel information. According to accounts, he was tied up and subjected to extreme intimidation in an effort to extract confessions or names. This moment, etched in his memory with fear and fury, broke something inside him. After recovering, Jesse made a choice. Not of ideology, but of vengeance. He joined the guerrilla unit led by Bloody Bill Anderson, one of the most feared Confederate raiders in Missouri. If Frank was forged in battle, Jesse was sharpened in revenge. Under Anderson's command, Jesse participated in raids that blurred the line between warfare and terrorism. The war in Missouri was not one of organized armies. It was guerrilla chaos, brutal, fast, and merciless. And Jesse, with a pistol in each hand and justice in his mind, became a boy soldier baptized in blood. What began as a childhood on a quiet Missouri farm had now turned into a crucible of fire, betrayal, and war. Jesse James was no longer just a preacher's son or a playful farm boy. He was now part of something darker, something bigger, something that would never quite let him go. From this point on, Jesse wasn't riding for a cause. He was riding because the cause had already ridden through him, and what came next would make his name legendary. If war is a crucible, then Missouri was fire without mercy. And Jesse James, like his brother Frank, didn't just pass through it. He was remade by it. By 1863, the war had ceased to resemble any form of honorable conflict. Guerrilla warfare consumed Missouri in waves of unspeakable violence, raids, ambushes, executions. Entire towns burned to the ground in the name of vengeance. In this chaos, the James brothers found not just a cause, but a calling. Frank, hardened by the battlefield, joined the infamous Quantrill's Raiders, a Confederate guerrilla unit that answered not to flags or laws, but to blood. They struck from the shadows and vanished into the woods, ghosts on horseback. And at Lawrence, Kansas, they left behind not legend, but massacre. On August 21, 1863, 300 raiders descended upon the town before dawn. Lawrence had been a stronghold of Union support, a city hated by the Confederacy for its abolitionist voice. What happened next was no military operation. It was revenge by fire. Homes were torched, businesses looted. Nearly 180 men and boys were murdered in the streets. The blood ran so deep that even Quantrill's name became synonymous with terror. Frank James was among the raiders, and whether out of loyalty or belief, he never looked back. The following year, another storm gathered. Centralia, Missouri, September 27, 1864, a sleepy town, a quiet morning. Then over 100 guerrillas, led by Bloody Bill Anderson, rode in. Jesse James, just 17, was now among them, not as a boy but as a fighter. The gang looted stores, set buildings aflame, and murdered a civilian who resisted. When a Union train arrived, the guerrillas dragged out 24 unarmed soldiers, wounded, helpless. They were executed in cold blood, shot down before a horrified town. Hours later, Union Major A.V.E. Johnston led federal reinforcements in pursuit, but they walked into a death trap. In the fields south of Centralia, the Confederates laid ambush. When the smoke cleared, over 120 Union soldiers were dead. Just 3 guerrillas fell. Among the Confederate ranks, it was said that Jesse himself gunned down Major Johnston. His name began to spread. No longer just Frank's younger brother, Jesse was becoming a myth in the making. A young man born into grief, sharpened by war, and baptized in the fire of guerrilla vengeance. But what war gives in purpose, it steals in peace. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the cannons fell silent, but Missouri remained haunted. The James family, Confederate in loyalty and blood, became targets of political revenge. Their land was scrutinized, their names blacklisted. Unionists still held power in many counties, and returning rebels were treated as traitors. Reconstruction offered little mercy to men like Frank and Jesse, men who had chosen the losing side. And so, injustice became justification. Where some saw criminals, they saw survivors. Where others saw thieves, they saw resistance. In the ashes of war, Jesse found something unexpected: love. He reconnected with Zerelda Amanda Mims, his cousin and childhood sweetheart. Despite their blood ties, their bond grew deeper, more intimate. In Zerelda, Jesse found calm in a world that had none, a kindred soul who had known loss and chosen him anyway. But peace never lasted long for a James. Frank and Jesse claimed they had no choice but to turn to crime, that they were hunted men, refused work, and condemned by a government they never believed in. For them, the battlefield had simply changed. In the years after the war, they began assembling a gang of like-minded ex-Confederates, men who had tasted blood and refused to bow to Union rule. Among them was Jim Reed, and eventually the infamous younger brothers, Cole, Bob, and Jim, sons of the South and soldiers of fortune. Together, they formed the James Younger Gang, a coalition of guns and ghosts, born not just out of greed, but out of ideology. To the public, they claimed to fight for the South still, not for slavery, but for the agrarian way of life, for the farmers against the bankers, the working poor against the industrialists. They painted their robberies not as crimes, but as acts of rebellion against the northern elite. And the public, battered by war, bitter with politics, listened. They saw in Jesse James a modern-day Robin Hood, a rebel with charm and cause. What few understood is that Jesse believed in the myth as much as anyone else. He wasn't just robbing banks, he was robbing the future he believed had been stolen from him. What came next would be louder, bloodier, more famous: the rides, the heists, the deaths, the legend. And Jesse, always with a pistol on his hip and a cause in his heart, would ride deeper into the pages of history, one bullet at a time. When the smoke of war cleared, Jesse James did not hang up his guns. He simply changed his target. The year was 1866, and Missouri was still licking its wounds. A land fractured humilhada, divided between those who had lost the war and those who believed they'd won too much. The people were poor. The laws were cruel. And trust was a currency more rare than gold. In this uncertain dawn, Jesse and Frank James re-emerged. No longer soldiers, but something far more dangerous: outlaws with a cause. On February 13, 1866, the James Younger Gang made their entrance into American legend. Their first target, the Clay County Savings Association Bank, located in Liberty, Missouri, a small, quiet town with no idea it was about to become part of criminal history. The robbery was swift, surgical. The gang stormed in under daylight, something unheard of in peacetime. They demanded money and securities and vanished with over $60,000, a staggering sum for the time. As they made their escape, a stray bullet killed a 17-year-old bystander, a boy named George Wymore. It was the first life taken in the James Gang's criminal career, and it would not be the last. From there, the spree only grew bolder. Between 1866 and 1869, the gang robbed 8 more banks, as well as a Kansas City ticket office, slipping in and out of towns like smoke through shutters. Their tactics were simple: fast, precise, and fearless. They studied schedules, struck when least expected, and escaped through the labyrinthine countryside they knew better than any mapmaker. But Jesse James wasn't just becoming a master thief. He was becoming a story. It started with dime novels, sensationalized booklets printed in the East, devoured by readers who dreamed of the untamed West. These pamphlets didn't care much for fact. What they wanted was myth, and Jesse gave them everything they needed. He was young, handsome, a former Confederate, a man who, according to the tales, robbed the corrupt bankers, insulted greedy sheriffs, and gave to the poor. Whether or not the latter was true never really mattered. The press turned him into the American Robin Hood, a rebel with a revolver and a code of honor. And Jesse, ever the showman, leaned into it. He began writing letters to newspapers, signing them with flair, taunting lawmen, framing himself as a victim of persecution and a champion of the common people. He became not just a criminal but a political figure. To some he was a threat, to others a hero. To all he was a name that could no longer be ignored. But attention has a price, and Jesse's rising fame brought with it a new enemy, one that wouldn't be fooled by legends or distracted by charm. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Founded by Alan Pinkerton, the agency had made its name by protecting railroads, banks, and industry, the very institutions Jesse James saw as enemies of the South. By the early 1870s, bankers and railroad magnates had grown desperate to end the gang's reign. They hired Pinkerton to do what no sheriff could, bring Jesse James to justice. The agency took the job with ruthless enthusiasm. Agents began tracking former Confederates, interrogating neighbors, even posing as farmhands on nearby properties. They gathered names, studied escape routes, paid informants. And then, in January 1875, they made their move. What happened next would become one of the darkest chapters in Jesse's story. Under cover of night, a Pinkerton posse surrounded the James family farm, believing Jesse and Frank were inside. They threw an incendiary device, a kind of primitive grenade, through the window of the house. Inside, the James family was unaware of the danger. Their 8-year-old half-brother Archie mistook the device for firewood and tossed it into the fireplace. The explosion that followed was devastating. Archie was killed instantly. Zerelda, their mother, lost part of her hand. The house was torn apart, the family shattered. But Jesse James did not die that night. He wasn't even there. Instead, he heard what had happened and vowed vengeance. The event was reported in newspapers across the country, and public sympathy, once divided, began to shift dramatically in Jesse's favor. For the first time, many Americans saw him not as a bandit, but as a victim of a brutal agency that had gone too far. And Jesse, master of public narrative, used that to his advantage. From that moment on, he became harder to find, harder to follow. He adopted the alias Thomas Howard, dyed his hair darker, and grew a beard to hide his boyish features. He moved from town to town with his wife Zerelda Mims and their growing family, always a few steps ahead of the law. But Jesse James was no longer just hiding. He was evolving. He no longer robbed only for survival or fame. Now he robbed for revenge. Every train that fell, every bank that burned, was in his mind a reckoning. The Pinkertons had tried to silence him. Instead, they made him a symbol, and he would wield that like a weapon. And so, the game escalated. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hunted had become a ghost riding the rails of a broken country, laughing in the face of the empire that wanted him gone. Jesse James was no longer just a man. He was the rebellion that refused to die. Even legends long for peace. By 1874, after years of bloodshed, robbery, et persecution, Jesse James did something unexpected. He stopped running. For a moment, at least. He returned not to the saddle but to the altar. On April 24th, Jesse married Zerelda Amanda Mims, his cousin and lifelong sweetheart. The ceremony was quiet, held in Kansas City, and performed by Reverend William James, Jesse's own uncle. Two rebels united not just by love, but by blood, both literal and spilled. Their bond was unshakable. Zerelda, known as Z, had waited through the war, the scandals, the fugitive years. She had stood beside Jesse not as a follower, but as a pillar, the one person who saw the boy behind the gun. After the wedding, they lived under aliases, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Howard, renting a farm near Waverly, Missouri, blending into the landscape like any other couple rebuilding a post-war life. Jesse even dyed his hair darker and grew a beard to help the illusion. For a brief window, Jesse tried to live a normal life, working the land, raising livestock, attending church. Their first child, Jesse Edward James, was born in August 1875. A daughter, Mary Susan, followed in 1879, born in Nashville, Tennessee, where the couple took refuge with Frank and his wife Annie for a time. But Jesse was no farmer, not in soul. The land could not quiet the fire inside him, the unrest, the unfinished war, the ever-present eye of the Pinkertons in the dark. And so, as corn grew in the fields, Jesse began planning again. He wasn't done. Not yet. The next job would be the boldest and deadliest the gang had ever attempted. The target: the First National Bank of Northfield in Minnesota. Far from Missouri, far from suspicion, a clean town full of money, lightly guarded, or so they thought. In September 1876, Jesse and Frank James rode north alongside the younger brothers, Cole, Bob, and Jim, as well as Charlie Pitts, Bill Chadwell, and two former Confederate soldiers, Clell Miller, and a man known only as Woods. They scoped the bank, studied the guards, timed the flow of the town. Then on September 7th, just 2 days after Jesse's 29th birthday, they struck. At first, the robbery went according to plan. Jesse and Bob Younger entered the bank. They demanded the safe be opened, but the cashier, Joseph Lee Haywood, refused. He lied, saying it was locked on a timer. He refused not just out of duty, but out of defiance. He had heard of Jesse James, and he would not surrender his town to legend. The gang grew nervous. Outside, townspeople had begun to notice something was wrong. A shout rang out, a shot fired, and suddenly Northfield became a war zone. Citizens, armed with pistols, hunting rifles, whatever they could grab, began firing on the gang. From windows, rooftops, saloons, they turned their peaceful town into a fortress. Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell were shot and killed in the streets. Inside the bank, Jesse executed Haywood, shooting him in the head. The rest of the gang panicked. The plan had failed. The only way out was through blood and fire. They fled. Wounded, disoriented, and scattered, the gang tried to escape into the countryside, but the people of Minnesota were not passive. Posses were formed, bounties posted, traps laid. Within 2 weeks, the younger brothers were surrounded and captured, all three badly wounded. Charlie Pitts was killed in a shootout, but Jesse and Frank and the Shadow Twins vanished once again, riding hard through woods and rivers, changing names, abandoning wounded horses to avoid capture. They made it back to Missouri. Barely. But something had changed. The James Younger gang was no more. The myth had taken its first true wound, and Jesse knew it. In the years that followed, Jesse and Frank continued to rob. But the golden age was gone. Their gang was rebuilt with lesser men, newcomers with little loyalty and even less skill. Still, Jesse would not stop. He robbed trains, he robbed banks. He watched the world close in around him like a noose made of names and maps. Yet even then, he believed in his own invincibility. The Pinkertons had failed. The law had failed. His enemies lay dead or defeated. But Jesse forgot one truth. You don't outrun time. You only delay its reckoning. And Jesse James's reckoning was coming fast. In the end, it wasn't the law that brought down Jesse James. It was routine. It was boredom. It was betrayal. From the one place he never expected to find it, inside his own home. After years of escapes, disguises, and dust-covered gunfights across the American frontier, Jesse sought, or pretended to seek, what so many men before him had also dreamed of: peace. By late 1881, Jesse James had settled with his wife, Zerelda, and their 2 children in St. Joseph, Missouri, in a modest house on Lafayette Street. There he lived under the name Thomas Howard, a respectable, hard-working, invisible farmer. An ordinary man, a family man, a ghost with a new face. But ghosts don't rest, and legends don't retire. And Jesse was not made for normal life. Even amid domestic calm, he hadn't given up his plans. There was still one last great robbery to pull off, and for that, Jesse enlisted 2 brothers who had recently earned his trust: Robert Bob Ford and Charles Ford. Bob was young, ambitious. He admired Jesse, but also envied him in silence. And Jesse, perhaps out of weariness or misplaced confidence, let his guard down. On the morning of April 3rd, 1882, destiny finally arrived. It was an ordinary day. The sun hung high over St. Joseph. Jesse was having breakfast with the Ford brothers, calmly discussing the final details of the next heist. The children played. Z tidied the house. There was a strange calm in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. As they talked, Jesse noticed a picture hanging crooked on the wall. A nearly symbolic gesture, a piece of history out of place. He stepped up onto a chair, turned around to straighten it, and Bob Ford drew his pistol. Without hesitation, he fired into the back of Jesse James's head. The bullet tore through his skull. Jesse collapsed to the floor, dead instantly. He was 34 years old, a father of 2 small children, a husband whose wife screamed as she ran to him, and a legend silenced by a single bullet. Bob Ford shot him in the back, while Jesse, unarmed, was straightening a picture. The hero was gunned down like a dog. Jesse's death was an earthquake. His body was quickly embalmed on ice and put on public display, drawing crowds eager to see with their own eyes that the myth had fallen. Lines stretched through the night. Soon after, the body was returned to the family farm in Kearney, where it was buried under guard. His mother, Zerelda, ordered these words to be engraved on his tombstone: "In loving memory of my beloved son, murdered by a traitor and a coward whose name is not worthy of mention." But the name was mentioned, and repeated, and cursed. The Ford's betrayal came at a price. Bob and Charles Ford, believing they would be celebrated as national heroes, turned themselves in that same day. Bob had struck a deal with Missouri's governor, Thomas T. Crittenden. In exchange for Jesse's death, he would receive a full pardon and a $10,000 reward. But what awaited them was disgust. The America that had once admired the outlaws' daring exploits did not forgive their cowardice. Killing Jesse James from behind without a trial was seen not as justice, but treachery. Within months, the Fords went from murderers to outcasts. Charles Ford, the elder and more unstable of the two, sank into remorse, paranoia, and public shame. 2 years after the assassination, in 1884, he took his own life with a bullet to the chest. Bob, meanwhile, tried to profit from the tragedy. He created a stage play called The Outlaws of Missouri, in which he played himself, the man who killed Jesse James. The audiences, however, booed. They shouted insults. In some towns they threw coins, mud, even stones. Bob fled west, opening saloons and trying to disappear, but Jesse's shadow followed him, in every mirror, every face. On June 8, 1892, in Creede, Colorado, Bob Ford was shot in the back of the head, just like Jesse. The killer, Edward O'Kelly, entered his saloon, looked him in the eyes and said only, "Hello, Bob." The gunshot echoed like 1882 reborn, and thus ended the life of the man who killed Jesse James. Jesse's death sealed his legend, but the way he died and who killed him turned him into a martyr. He wasn't captured in battle. He wasn't tried in court. He wasn't defeated by strength. He was betrayed in silence at home by friendly hands. And that cruel, cowardly act ensured that Jesse James would never be forgotten. For 15 years, the James Younger gang rode through the American frontier like a storm with no name. Their legacy, carved in blood and gold, was as staggering as it was undeniable. 26 robberies, over $200,000 stolen, and at least 17 men left dead in their wake. They weren't just a gang, they were a movement, an echo of a war that refused to die. And yet, after the fall of Jesse James, the outlaw saga did not end. It limped onward, wounded but breathing, through the life of his brother. In October 1882, just 6 months after Jesse's death, Frank James walked alone into the governor's office in Jefferson City, Missouri. He removed the 2 revolvers from his holster, placed them on the desk before Governor Thomas Crittenden and said, "I want to surrender. These are the only weapons that have ever touched my hands since 1861. The man who once outgunned Union troops and vanished into forests now stood before the law, tired, aged, and ready to face judgment. Frank was arrested and tried in 2 states, but despite the sensational nature of the trials, he was acquitted of all charges. Witnesses vanished, evidence crumbled, and perhaps most critically, the public still loved the name James. So Frank walked free, not as a criminal, but as a survivor of history. As the dust settled and the guns were holstered for good, something strange began to happen. The world turned the outlaw into a tourist attraction. Jesse's mother, Zerelda, a woman forged by frontier grief and stubborn resilience, leaned fully into her son's legend. She began charging visitors to tour the family farm, offering stories, souvenirs, and even selling rocks from Jesse's grave, though legend says she quietly restocked the supply from the nearby creek when demand exceeded supply. People came by the hundreds, curious travelers, amateur historians, and thrill seekers, all eager to walk the same ground where Jesse James once saddled his horse, where the Pinkertons spilled blood, and where America's most famous outlaw grew into myth. Eventually, when Zerelda was too old to manage the business, Frank James himself took over the role of caretaker and storyteller. And what a storyteller he was. He traveled across the country, appearing in Wild West shows, carnivals, and public spectacles, not as a man on the run, but as a living link to a bygone era. People paid just to shake his hand. He posed for photos, gave interviews, and kept the flame of Jesse's legend alive, not with a gun, but with a grin. In 1902, Jesse's body was exhumed from the farm and reburied in Mount Olivet Cemetery, laid to rest beside his beloved wife, Z. It was a symbolic move, taking the myth from the muddy roots of Missouri and planting it among marble and memory. The house where he died became a shrine. The bullet hole on the wall was never patched. His guns were preserved. His name etched into the brickwork of American folklore. And Frank James, the last outlaw of his kind, lived quietly on the family farm until 1915, passing away at the age of 72. He died not in battle, not in betrayal, but in peace, surrounded by the echoes of a life that had once shaken a nation. But the legend, it never died. Jesse James became more than a man. He became a symbol of rebellion, of resistance, of tragedy and charm. He was the outlaw who dared to speak back to power, the thief who wrote to newspapers, the killer who kissed his children goodnight. In books, he was romanticized. In film, he was immortalized. More than 40 films have portrayed Jesse James as hero or villain, or both. Songs were written. Cities renamed streets in his honor. And in the imagination of the American West, he still rides. This is more than history. This is myth. This is the legacy of the James Younger Gang, a legend born in war, hardened in robbery and sealed by betrayal. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Wild West, where fact and folklore ride side by side, and the line between hero and outlaw is never quite clear. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more legends uncovered, unraveled and retold like never before, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a single tale from the frontier. Because out here, in the land of dust and gunpowder, every name has a story, and some never die.